Our next dialogue, we have three, for me, very interesting humans. We've seen a lot about complex system and the complexity of decision-making, the complexity of understanding influences, the complexity of the cities, the places we live, the influences on where we live and how we live, the influences on the natural systems upon which we depend for our lives, the natural systems all around us, and they're all connected. And what we do know is that water flows all around us and water flows inside of us and through us. And so it's a very interesting and fascinating topic. How many of you drink or would drink recycled water? How many of you drink it right now? Are you sure? Recycled through natural systems. There was recently a vote in Melbourne, Australia, whether or not they would accept drinking water which had gone through a sewage plant. I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio. I think I told you before. We knew, maybe I didn't tell you, that the water which I drank had gone already through, they calculated on 16 living beings, things before I drank it. Took it out of the Ohio River. You look at it, it's brown and muddy, and oh my gosh. We have one of the highest cancer rates in the country. I'm not quite sure exactly why, but we knew that. Most places drink virgin water, for example, here. It's hard to imagine that one would take and drink the water out of a sewage plant. But maybe we should. Why wouldn't we? And what about nature? How can nature help us with these systems? Well, our three guests are going to tell us a lot about this. So we have Parneet, Tobias, and Christian. Why don't the three of you come on up, please? Tobias, Parneet, and Christian, come on up. Now, the advantage and disadvantage of going on day, my God, today's 6, right? Today's day 6? It feels like it is.
48.
Day 48, I say right. That most people have seen you and talked with you, or many have. So Parneet is a trained physician working at the intersection of lifestyle medicine, technology, and behavioral change. An educator, science communicator, she applies her subject matter expertise to optimize human health and performance and its impact on planetary well-being. She's always looking for connections and interdependencies within human and planetary systems to make them more resilient and regenerative. I love that description. That's so cool. Tobias, in the middle, is a systems thinker, part-time professor at a couple of institutions, including where I am, and an alumni, being a Year 2040 alumni, came last year, and he's the co-founder. We saw him last night talking about the members mapping, and a co-founding director of Monviso, you're going to correct me, I'm sorry, man, which is the Monviso Institute, spending his time on ecological and complex mountain systems, considering things like, really, what are the downstream effects of climatic change? Very interesting, actually. Looking forward to hearing more about it. And Christian, his background is in economic geography, which is quite intriguing, actually. And his topical focus is on the transformative innovation of water and energy systems in cities. He's rethinking building systems, in particular water, to make them circular and self-sufficient. And he even brought a prop. It's going to be a very different prop than what you saw before, but not too dissimilar in some ways. So I'm going to start with Parneet. Parneet, when we talked ahead of time, you talked quite a bit about mitochondrial energy. What is that, and why should we care?
Well, how many of you are feeling drained right now? So the amount of energy that you're feeling right now is directly proportional to the quality and quantity of that mitochondrial energy that you're producing in your cells. So mitochondria, if you're not aware, are the power plants of our cells. And they're fascinating structures, which we can talk a little bit more about later. But so the food that we take in, mixed with the oxygen that we breathe, is then transformed in our mitochondria to produce ATP, which is a currency of energy in our bodies, and we produce CO2, and we also exhale out water. And water is a part of this whole process of respiration. But your postures right now and my posture right now, the amount of focus that we're bringing to this conversation, whether or not we are feeling that we're in a trusting place and want to collaborate with each other, or if we are open to ideas and everyone else's perspective, all of these things are directly related to that quality and quantity of mitochondrial energy. And water is kind of the thread that ties it all together. So I know Tobias and Christian are experts in water systems outside of the body, but my area of interest is how can we optimize the flow of water inside our body so that we can show up in ways that are not just resilient but transformative. So when we think about the impact of health and climate, I always find that it's a very depressing story, right? So earlier this morning we talked about how waterborne disease is a huge problem, and of course the indirect effects of climate on air pollution, or on vector-borne disease, and food production. That conversation on health can get very depressing, and so my idea was, how can we turn health into an asset? How can we make sure that we optimize this flow of water in our bodies in such a way that we produce the kind of energy that influences climate action in a net positive way? So we can get into the details of that as we go along.
I think we'll come back to that in just a minute, because I want to move over to Tobias, because Tobias talks around this ecosystems, ecosystems, biosystems. Your focus from Mondvisio is not just a single place, but a whole place. So tell us about that.
Yeah, it's really scaling in and scaling out. I think it's about the practice to consciously enter a complex system in one sphere. It could be the built environment, the building. It could be human. It could be the landscape or the region. And then take care of the complexities, circularities, plural, of this specific scale, but then practice at the same time to zoom in all the way to green chemistry, all the way out to transnational cooperation. And the connection, when I hear you about your work, then it connects right away to a human who is in a building, who takes a shower and who receives water and who drains water, or who use the toilet, liquid or dry or whatever. And so it's just an example for systems thinking, where we have our own sphere of influence, our starting point, but we practice literally in different ways to zoom in and zoom out and go all the way in the detail, mitochondria, what you described, and all the way out to global water supplies, because they're so connected. And it's beautiful to design experiences to see ourselves within that system. And that's what we do basically with water, but also with other systems that are all connected.
And Mondvisio is not too far from here.
It depends if you cycle or if you drive, but it's that direction. It's in the Italian, French, ridge line close to Torino, and it's a similar elevation like here, and just a totally different cultural ecosystem because of its history.
Yeah, and yet it's the other side of the mountains.
Yeah, the Southern Alps, so between France and Italy.
Yeah, thank you. And let's talk about zooming in and zooming out. Right, and this is something you are also doing as well. So tell us a little bit about your work.
Yes, so I'm basically thinking all the time about how you can transform a complex system like the water sector. And the problem we have is that basically we rely on a system that's 2,000 years old. So the logic we have in our current water system comes from the old Roman Empire. So what we do is basically we take water somewhere, we transport it into the city, we then pollute it and send it out of the city. Nowadays we treat it, and then it ends up in a river or a lake or whatever, and it still causes some pollution problems. And so this even reaches up here. So I learned yesterday that this building is actually pumping the water up from the valley. So it comes up here, then we use it, we flush it down the toilet, it goes down in another long pipe, and then it's being treated down in the valley. And so this, as you can imagine, I think it's very inefficient. And so in today's world, and if you think about sustainable futures, then there must be a new way in how we can configure this system. And so my idea, and that of many of my colleagues at ERWAG, is that we close the loop of the water sort of circle on much smaller scales inside the building, basically. So you have a recycling shower that just uses 4 liters of water and recycles that all the time. Or you have a small treatment plant in the building basement, which then sends the water back. It recovers nutrients, it recovers energy. You can use that again in the building. Or, one example which we have developed over the past 10, 20 years is a system that really takes the nutrients out of your waste. And we have a small, actually a toilet that separates the urine from the rest of your, what's in the toilet. And then it sends it in a small pipe. There's a small treatment plant in the basement, which treats it into a high-quality fertilizer. So that's what comes out of that system, is like a really high-quality fertilizer. It's the same quality as sort of conventional fertilizer. So by solving a water problem, you also solve a problem of agriculture. So you can replace fossil-based fertilizer with a human-based fertilizer. And so you can actually pass this around. My friends tell me it smells a bit like whiskey. I'm not sure if that's the right description, but just pass it on and see, just experience what that is.
I don't want to be the first test.
So it's a very local sort of Swiss-made product. It's from EAWAG, from a lot of crazy scientists that work there. So that's just one example of what is possible in today's world. There's many places that also really drink the water that's being produced in the basement. You can even put it to drinkable quality. So there's all these ideas. We could really close these loops. And then this has a lot of implications also psychologically on public health. So what does it do with us if we suddenly, what we flush down the toilet one evening comes back the next morning in our showers? So there's a lot of interesting open questions that we also discussed a bit already.
But it's really interesting, this idea of the closed system versus the open system. The closed system, as you've indicated, we just recycle your 4 liters or whatever of water round and round. But our bodies are not closed systems. Our bodies are actually open systems, right? Things come in and go out. So, and Manviso is also an open system, and that you interact with other parts. So what's the difference within the water open system and the closed system when we're thinking about our bodies?
So I think water is a good proxy for understanding just the rhythms of the body, and through those rhythms we can begin to understand the connection between this ecosystem and our external environment. So just to paint a more concrete picture, I think we all know that our bodies are 60 to 70% of water. I think everybody knows that. But I just want you to think for a second that right now, like your brain, your heart, your lungs, your kidneys, they're about 80% water. Your blood is about 85% water. Your skin is about 70% water. Even your bones are 25% water. And water is critical in the body to help us survive within a very narrow range. So whether it's our body temperature or the pH of our blood. And it's both the container, but also a participant in thousands of metabolic reactions in the body. And the reason that I sort of chose to focus on mitochondrial energy is because it's that connection between the inside and the outside, if you will, of that loop. And again, water is part of the process, but it also contains the tissues and other organelles in the cell that produce that energy. But then I think for me, when we start to talk about regeneration and these loops in the body, what I get really excited about is that we have inbuilt one of the best regenerative mechanisms in our mitochondrial cells that we don't actually get an opportunity to tap into, or we don't because of the lifestyles that we lead. I'd love for all of us to think about how we can engage that regenerative mechanism more often.
So what would be a key activity we should do?
Yeah, so, maybe can I explain a little bit about the principles? Because I think that's...
You do that first, and then Tobias a question,
So I think there's 2 things to think about. The first is that our body is not a silo. So again, coming back to that question of the interaction between the inside and the outside. So the mitochondria themselves are ancient bacteria, single-celled bacteria, that entered into a symbiotic relationship with multicellular organisms. So if you think about it, the reason that you're alive and well right now and can have whatever impact you have in the world is thanks to these really ancient bacteria that are part of our cellular mechanisms. And then, of course, our body also has trillions of bacteria, viruses, and fungi, both on our skin, in our mouths, in our stomach, and the most popularly known is our gut microbiome. And so these systems talk to each other, right? So our cells talk to the through the mitochondrial energy, exchange information along with the microbiome as well. So that's one thing. And the mitochondrial energy is not produced at random. So I'll just slow down. And so our mitochondria are communicating with the movement of the sun in our environment. And this is what produces a flow of our hormones, of our energy, of our sleep-wake and our hunger-thirst cycles throughout the day, right? So there's a beautiful rhythm of these cycles that are tied to our mitochondrial energy and this communication between our internal and external world. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. And so if we want to optimize that energy and that flow of water, we need to respect what's happening in our external environment and pay attention to that as well. And then the second principle is that there's this balance between growth and repair in our body. And you know, so we want that growth of proteins, of cells, of happening through, you know, most of our activities during the day. That's what they're designed for. But at night, we want to also engage in the restorative and regenerative processes as well. And there are three, and I'm sorry, I'm geeking out a little bit.
You're going to geek into it, but you have to close it in.
So I'll just say that tapping into that regenerative mechanism involves stimulating 3 different genetic pathways. And based on our lifestyles that we live, we don't normally do that. But if we do, there's this beautiful system which I think you guys will recognize in terms of taking the waste that's produced through our metabolism and recycling and upcycling that, repairing our DNA, but also producing this capacity for what's called metabolic flexibility. So which is no matter what source of fuel you have, you're able to produce a sustained level of energy throughout the day. So how do you do that? So I know you're getting to like the very practical bits. The first one is align your lifestyle with the movement outside in nature, right? So you want to wake up as close to sunrise as you can and get that first burst of light and energy.
We should be getting up at 4:30 right now.
Or whenever the sun rises, yeah.
Okay,
And
4:30, 5
maybe
o'clock.
within 30 minutes to an hour, ideally.
So everyone was going to be awake at 4:30 tomorrow. All right, number 1, good. 2.
Even if you can't wake up at 4:30, whenever you do wake up, just go outside and make sure that you get about 5 to 10 minutes of that natural light to stimulate your systems. And then make sure that when you're sleeping really close to, you're optimizing your internal built environment to mimic the low lighting outside. You also want to make sure that you eat a plant-rich diet. Now, I know everybody knows that and how important that is for our food systems. But what is less well known is that a plant-rich diet also stimulates those regenerative pathways of that cycling and upcycling and repair mechanisms. And then the final thing is that you want to make sure that you're stressing your body intentionally, and this process is called hormesis. So you can do things like intermittent fasting or just time-restricted eating for 8 to 12 hours in the day. You can expose yourself to extreme temperatures of cold or heat, so taking a cold shower or using the sauna. And then the final thing is just making sure that you move your body in some way, and especially in bursts of intensive intermittent activity.
Great. So we're going to be able to do a few of those tonight. We have the plant-based diet. We're going to have dancing.
Yes.
I didn't hear the gin and tonic in there, but I guess that fits as well in the lifestyle. So we're going to, that's good. So we're going to Thank you for that. I want to move to Tobias. Tobias, Parneet just talked about the symbiosis and how over time our bodies have evolved as various symbiotic relationships. In your work, looking at systems, where do you see some of the primary relationships in the water systems you've been designing? Because this is something that's also important to you, I know. So tell us a little bit about some of those key symbiotic things that you have discovered.
Yeah, so I can so much attach to both what you said. It's really interesting. I'm smiling because it's so connected. And so systems are the richest where system boundaries interconnect, like in ecotones, ecosystems. And so we understand boundaries more like a porous connector. It's not a boundary, it's like a limit. It's like a porous element that connects different systems, and diversity is very high in these elements. So when you talk about this beautiful fertilizer, I think about a group of college students from in a boarding school who just spent 10 days in the Monvise environment to camp out for 8 days doing solos, like 20 years old, between the high school and the study program. Then they came to us for a day to engage in systems and understand how nature and humans, we are part of nature, I know, but how we interact and how we function together. And so they would use a toilet that's liquid dry separation, and they would learn that if you separate both, it doesn't smell. They would see the urine flowing down and we collect it. And they would also have the feces, which are treated with sawdust and some lime, and then kept for 2 to 3 years in a compost. And then we take that out and we heat it up to 70 degrees to account for any worm eggs that might be from a human body in there. And then we use this compost, we use the urine, and we use nettles that grow, orticae. And we put the nettles in water for 2 weeks, and so it creates like a very strong nitrogen fertilizer. And we have these students who had a campfire in the evening, making pizza as well, taking that charcoal, which is not biochar, but it's pretty good, and infecting it with the fertilizer from the urine, from the nettles, and also mixing it with compost. And then bring that out in the field, in the orto, in the vegetable garden, in the hemp field. And so just one example how one thing leads to the next one, and we really have many entry points of interconnectedness, where we, either through food, through hygiene, through movement, through experiences, are very much connected to anywhere in these systems. And then they zoom out, they got back, and they talk to me and say, you know what, that discussion we had yesterday on the campfire, and sowing hemp and doing the fertilizer, it totally changed my life. I'm actually going to rethink what I'm studying from September on. It's not like just engineering, it's engineering renewable energies. Many of them came. And so I think, and then they'll go back and they look for this fertilizer because it's a ready product. This to me is just one example of this beauty of immersing in a real world experiment with all the uncertainties that we have. But it's really connecting what you're talking about, the inner body perspective, with even some plug and play systems that you develop. And that's maybe for me one aspect to look at interconnectedness in system as boundaries of porous connecting elements and of symbiosis of various kind.
That's really great. Thanks, Tobias. And you mentioned right there something which I found very intriguing, which is the real world connectedness. And Christian, when I come to you and we think about the real world connectedness, you had, I found, a very compelling vision, which is saying, look, 50 years from now or 40 years from now, we're going to have in our cities perhaps a challenge with urban water. And your real world circumstance was, well, why couldn't a building become its own recycling plant? So what would it take in your mind as an economic geographer to help some of these real world circumstances make that next step?
Yeah, thanks. So that's a good question. Basically the vision is really that when you have these closed loop systems, you can really rethink how we build cities, where we build buildings, because you don't need any sort of pipes anymore. You don't need, the electricity can come from the sun, the data through the air, and then the water is in a closed loop. And so you can make city districts pop up somewhere, you can transport it to a new place, you can create a small village in a mountain place, which is maybe not inhabited anymore, and rejuvenate it. So all these visions suddenly become possible. And so the thing is, going there, it really means we have to deeply shift our mind, and especially this point that there's no waste in nature, right? So that's really key. So people's mindset need to shift to say, okay, what we were socialized into treating as waste, what comes out of our body is actually a resource, for other things. And so you get closer to that if you close these loops, and you need to struggle with this idea. But once you do, and you see it works in practice, there's beauty in this in a way. And so the key point now for the future is, of course, that, it's really systemic innovation. So people only believe that it works when they see it somewhere and it's installed somewhere, and you can actually see the co-benefits it creates, and it's tangible, and you can smell it and just see it. And so for that we need, some sort of, I would say, high-profile lighthouse projects where you install it somewhere in a sort of experimental setting. Could well be up here on that mountain, would be really nice. So you create a system that creates this, that showcases this new vision. And then you make it accessible to people. They can watch it, they can take the fertilizer home, they can experience what it feels like. And so then a next place will look at this and say, okay, yeah, there's a really interesting new design sort of idea in this, and we will replicate it, we will adapt it to our circumstances, but we will take the templates. And I think we lack these templates, this big, large scale, also at the level of a city district maybe, where you integrate a lot of systems, energy, water, nutrients, biodiversity, livability. And you make it tangible and visible, and then from there on, these things can scale. And I would say, once we have that, they can actually scale really fast, and much faster.
Do you have it anywhere? Have you done it? But you've done a few prototypes, I know that.
Yeah, we have some, yeah. So we also did actually, there are prototypes on other mountain sort of cable car stations in Zermatt. There's two of those systems that recycle the water from the toilets and then send it back to the faucets, and often then people drink the water and they only learn the next day that it was recycled wastewater, and then they complain with the gondola sort of companies. But it's not really dangerous. And so there's many other places where we see it being installed in California, in Bengaluru, in India. There's a lot of these systems. It's all over, but it's still a sort of not well known, and we still need these sort of really sort of lighthouse, highly visible sort of templates.
But this is what's interesting to me, because I know you've done these. They're there, real-world circumstances. And Tobias, you have created this, and Parneet, each one of us has our own experimental object that we walk around with. So our real-world circumstances are quite there, already. What would be the one thing you would ask each of us to do? Because all of you are doers, which is why we're all here, but each of you are. So what would you ask of us over the next 24 hours and the next 24 days, the next 365 and a half? That's like a quarter day after we get here next time, whatever. So what would you ask of us? Parneet, what would one thing you'd ask of us?
I think the first, it's all well and good for me to give you a laundry list of what works for our biology, which I just did. But I think enacting those changes in your daily life is the hurdle with behavior change and sustaining that. So I would say the one question that I'd love for you all to reflect on is to think about the impact, the outer impact that you want to have in the world, and ask yourself, how can I use any one of the things that I just heard to help my biology work in my favor in a regenerative way? So what's the one thing that I can commit to help my mitochondria literally help me reach that impact? And so then then commit to that one behavioral change that you need to make.
And would you be willing to answer questions if people ask you, hey, this is my idea?
Absolutely.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you something. Tobias, same question. Thank you. That's really great. Tobias, what about you? What would one thing you'd ask of us?
So I would like to cite a colleague of mine, Justina Swat from NC, the design school, Les Ateliers in Paris. And she coined the term tiny labs. And it was coined in this massive open online course that we started at ETH 2 months ago, which has now 2,500 participants from 94 nations. And Justina helped to develop this MOOC and this topic. And so in the pandemic, she was really locked in Paris, much different than we in Switzerland. We were not really locked in a tiny home, in the roof. It was hot, and she was alone, and anxiety and stuff. And she speaks open about it. And so she developed different practices to experiment with regenerative interventions, and be it just to grow mushroom and fungi and mycelium, to, to have a 3D printer from her office to print with bioplastic and hemp fibers. Many different examples. And she, in one discussion, said it's not a real-world lab that you build in the mountains or up here in Lux or in a city, but it's tiny labs. It's in her own apartment. And so in discussion, we thought, how could we frame that? And we framed it as like anyone, anywhere, anytime can do these things. And so it's not a big thing we have to wait for, but we're all fractals of bigger systems. And so for me, these complex systems are wobbly things. If we try to grab it on one end, it will just wobble away like a pudding. If we have the current tools, it will just move away. But if we act as fractals and address it simultaneously at multiple elements and sides of the system, we can together carry it away. And so I would like to think us about tiny labs, anyone, anywhere, anytime, and think what that means for all of us. In the words of Justina.
Thank you. Same question, Christian?
Yeah, so I think it's about identifying the leverage points in these complex systems. So where can we engage, and really have an impact, not just on creating something new, but maybe also transforming the old. And so we had some really interesting discussions also over lunch today, how in the water sector, you could sort of act at the global level, at global corporations, trying to change their strategies with some sort of action. Then you can, of course, try to create these lighthouse cases that, show the sort of potential of this new paradigm that might emerge. And then maybe there's also leverage points at the personal level that you can trigger and think about how they then interrelate and might jointly sort of push change in a certain direction. So I think this could be really sort of valuable to think about where exactly is the place where I can sort of twist and tweak in the system and really create transformative change. And then how does that sort of happen at different levels by zooming in and out, and how does it all converge in the end?
I like that. So really deeply consider how we want to show up and the change we can make inside. Mm-hmm. Think about the tiny labs, actions we can do at home, in our apartments or wherever, and also the leverage points which we might have in other places through our professional, personal connections. Again, 3 different levels, which is really, really wonderful. We're at a point where we have a choice, and I'll be democratic. We can stop, take a breath, and enjoy a bit of air before the gondola, or we can take some questions. And it's really no pressure either way. Or we can ask this panel tonight at dinner. I think we're tired, which is why I asked. So, this is what I'm going to suggest. We don't have a program tonight. We're not going to make one, but you all are going to be there. So don't sit at the same table. And if something is on resonance with any of our wonderful dialogues, hang out with them this evening and chat, or on the dance floor. So I want to thank all three of you. That was really fantastic, fascinating, and give me things to think about, which every time is beautiful. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lynn.
Thanks.